Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 35 of series 9. The question for today is the discovery of the absence of values more radical than the absence of God? Reading, for those who want it, from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 7, section 2. Now, my overall objective is again to grasp human existence as consciousness and resolve its problems in terms of value. To do this, I have advocated the principle of the will to value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. And this has involved defining value in certain ways, such as subjectivity and using volition. Ralph Perry, for example, argued that values don't exist until someone desires something. Mackey also argues that there are no objective values in the fabric of the world, and I agree with him. Yet for Mackey, the word objective refers to substantive ontological existence, not universality. So here, the rejection of objective values doesn't preclude normative ethical values. Yet even without rejecting normative values, the subjectivity of values has radical consequences for our beliefs. That is, we can no longer take values off the shelf from some kind of metaphysical storehouse, and we must find some other foundation for values such as reason, choice, or consciousness. This is an enterprise that I have undertaken in other workshops and in other places. The issue here is that the status of value and values has changed from objectivity to subjectivity, and that where values were thought to exist, they no longer exist. And this has radical consequences for belief systems greater perhaps than the non-existence of God. Nietzsche, for example, proclaimed the death of God, but warned that religious values continue to exist. But existentialism, postmodernism, and critical philosophies of Perry and Mackey challenge those values. In this workshop, I want to discuss how that challenge to objective values affects our lives. That is, in aspects of life like morals, human rights, justice, social obligation, self-esteem, and meaning and purpose. And also want to discuss a new paradigm, that is, the rise of subjective value as well as the decline of objective value. My plan is to first look at values in religion and Christianity and their subsequent loss through secularization. I will then examine philosophical issues of value concerning morals, justice, and intrinsic value. And it will finally look at some consequences of absent values and possible means of rectification. So my objective is the displacement of illegitimate objective values to their appropriate place within subjectivity. And the significance of this displacement and subsequent absence of previously objective values can be seen in their illegitimate employment, as in religion, ethics, meaning and purpose, objective intrinsic values and attitudes to death, as well as those revealed by Sartrean notions of bad faith, inauthenticity, and postmodernist critiques of objectivity. Yet I've previously explained all these expressions of value in terms of their relations with cognitive frameworks. That is, value states can be assessed by their degree of independence from supporting cognitive frameworks. And this relation between value and cognitive objects reveals a deeper significance of their absence. Yet a still deeper significance of the absence of values can also be seen in an underlying ontology. I previously presented philosophy and mythology when it is covering up still deeper ideas. I would like to think of Hegel's and Sartre's non-being and nothingness in these terms. That is, non-being and nothingness are nothing without their significance as values. Yet to start with the significance of religion, it's not just a basic requirement that God is the believer's highest value. It is also a requirement needed by people who believe in God, that God loves them. A metaphysical God of first principles is called a philosopher's God who fails in his requirement to love us. Yet in Christianity, God also becomes man as representative of mankind's highest value, himself. Moreover, in Christianity, we have the idea of negation or death integrated into the highest value. I will later make use of this idea of integrating negativity into the highest value. Yet the idea that God does not exist undermines this huge edifice of values. To develop the point, the fact that God does not exist has more than just theoretical or personal consequences. Religious belief sustained an ethos, an ethics, and a system of meaning that can't be recaptured. Erich Fromm, for example, asked the question, what could take the place of religion in a world in which the concept of God may be dead, but in which the experiential reality behind it must live? Fromm, Nietzsche, and indeed myself regard the loss of religious belief as real deprivation, and this loss of belief and values as reflected throughout the social sciences. Max Weber, for example, looked at secularization, the decline of religion, the rise of economic and scientific rationality, leading to what he called a disenchantment of the world that he described in 1905 as the pursuit of wealth with purely mundane passions, of specialists without spirit and sensualists without heart, unquote. More dramatically, anomie, or a lack of values, was linked to suicide by Weber, Durkheim, and Robert Merton. Anomie is regarded as an absence of values, whereas alienation is more of a disjunction of values. And anomie implies social disengagement rather than the estrangement of alienation. Yet many social scientists, like Emil Durkheim, regarded unbelief as a step towards a growing human maturity. But the revolution of changing from objective to subjective values is greater than the death of God. And this view is also part of my own principle of independence, or a certain sufficiency of value. But surprisingly, even philosophy can be seen as a discipline that neglects and even undermines value and values. I have myself argued that the whole of Western philosophy is subject to cognitive and epistemological bias. I won't argue this here, except to note the prominence of questions of knowledge, logic, and language. Even phenomenology isn't exempt, seen in Husserl's true perception and reduction as an epistemological project. Heidegger also leans towards cognition and epistemology with his special apprehensions of being. Yet Kierkegaard and Nietzsche seem to be exceptions who saw philosophy as lived experience. And again, the consequences of a neglect of value in philosophy are more obvious in analytic philosophy. This neglect is evident in the cognitive, non-cognitive classification widely used in analytic philosophy. This classification is cognitively biased, defines non-cognitive states negatively, and fails to mention values specifically. So to rectify this omission, we need to add the three classifications of affect, will, and value to the classification. Yet this cognitive bias in analytic philosophy also affects theories of knowledge, ethics, and motivation. And some topics like experiential meaning, purpose, and aesthetics are largely neglected. I've frequently said that ethical principles are values that guide moral action. Yet even in ethics, moral values are widely thought to be obtained through knowledge, and the problem of resolving ethics in general usually seeks an answer in terms of knowledge. But of course, in my view, a foundation is to be found in consciousness and value itself. So although, for example, Ronald Dworkin is critical of rationalist methods of obtaining moral values, he nevertheless describes the independence of morality as a separate department of knowledge. Hume, Nietzsche and Bernard Williams make a similar point about morality as self-sufficient, and I want to use this view later with reference to the idea of self-sufficiency. The above are instances of undesirable omissions of value rather than desirable omissions of value. But before getting to the subjectivity of value as a form of value sufficiency that can omit value, I want to outline the concepts of intrinsic value, justice and human rights, that is, as mistaken ideas that result from misguided conceptions of objective value, and that intrinsic values and rights are mistaken objectifications of subjective values. To recap, in my view, only mental states and conscious beings, or people, are candidates of intrinsic value. And as noted above, Mackey argues that there are no objective values in the fabric of the world. He also holds that there are thereby no intrinsic values in the world for similar reasons. But many philosophers like Frank Kenner, Moore, Dworkin, Thomas Nagel and Derek Parfit believe in intrinsic values. Truth and beauty, such as works of art, have also been traditionally regarded as having intrinsic values, and although Moore opposes this view, he is strangely ambivalent on the issue of intrinsic value. Thomas Nagel also affirms a belief in intrinsic values, but he qualifies this in saying that, "I don't know how to establish whether there are any such values, but the objectifying tendency produces a strong impulse that there are." Unquote. Dworkin insists that paintings and great trees can have intrinsic value as well as actions or their principles, and Parfit adds that things like books and rational activity can have intrinsic value. I have argued against the idea of principles, actions and objects having intrinsic value elsewhere. I just want to cite here as examples of mistaken objectifications of value. These are examples of finding value where none exists, and they are also arguments for a preference for an absence of values. Yet more plausibly, justice and human rights are also often mistaken as being objective or having intrinsic value. But justice and human rights are abstract principles which are neither objective or have intrinsic value. It can be argued, for example, that both are anthropocentric constructions and that rights are objectified wants. David Hume, for example, held justice to be a human invention, but not one that society can dispense with. One criticism of justice that we won't discuss now is that it's a euphemism for revenge. But studies of macaques and capuchin have revealed a sense of fairness or relative deprivation that mirrors justice. One study showed a macaque's outrage at being given celery instead of grapes, and even throwing it back. My point is that feelings of justice can be based on animal rather than moral sentiments. Yet the notions of justice and human rights are closely related and mutually supportive. But both Bentham and Hume insisted that natural law and natural rights are unreal metaphysical phenomena. Bentham described the idea of natural rights that underpin justice as nonsense upon stilts. And Peter Singer regarded the idea of rights as a convenient political shorthand. Alistair MacIntyre further argues that the idea of human rights didn't exist before 1400. This supports the view that rights as well as justice are human inventions. Yet the notions of justice and rights may nevertheless be essential to maintaining social order. My point here is again that justice and rights are subjective values that have been objectified, and that we sometimes might be better off without such notions as objective or intrinsic values. Yet does this also indicate a widespread error in value theory that has gone unnoticed? And a consequence of this revaluation of justice as a value is that no one deserves anything. That is, objectively, no one deserves to be paid or rewarded for their efforts or punished for their misdeeds. But it's better that they are, in order to preserve social order and the sanity of those within it. Yet I want to expand this idea that subjective value, or an absence of objective value, can be a better option. Conversely, Robert Nozick believes that it is better that there are objective values, unquote. But objective values give less standing to choice, commitment, versatility, and internalization. In my writings, I have referred to this preference for subjective value or less or absent value as value refrain. An obvious justification of value refrain is evident in avoiding attitudes like animosity, scorn, and hate. A more refined application of value refrain is against making moralistic or condemnatory judgments. A similar application is found in the Christian tenet of forgiveness, as well as recent ethical thought. That is, psychological and social factors are increasingly preferred over moral explanations. Nietzsche's emphasis on the innocence of children also advocates a kind of refrain from moral value judgment, and this refrain becomes more pronounced in his ideas of beyond good and evil and aesthetic justification. Another philosophical example of value refrain is found in Sartre's idea of the spirit of seriousness. He repudiates the spirit of seriousness because it inauthentically regards subjective values as objective. Sartre claims that we do this in order to evade freedom and responsibility. The classic example is to regard courses of action as objectively fixed, such as when I say I have no choice when I do have a choice. Sartre's condemnation of taking subjective values as objective applies to choices, principles, or objects. And this also applies to the early rejection of the objective or intrinsic value of principles, actions, and objects. Yet Sartre speaks of another application in refraining from appropriating things for their own sake. And he says that people should try to realize the symbolic appropriation of these things. The idea of symbolic appropriation here not only conveys the notion of a preference for subjectivity over objectivity, but also that a supporting cognitive or ideological framework is being misappropriately used. And this exhibits a key relation between value states and supporting cognitive states. This indicates the philosophical and phenomenological significance of this relation, but it's not something to be taken further in this way in this discussion. So value refrain is understandable as avoiding moralizing negative values and even in phenomenologies of value. But subtle abstentions of value often appear to be ineffective against the engulfing turmoils of life. In this respect, the above discussions have illustrated the problem without giving a solution. My solution is a will to value leading to a sufficiency of value that can integrate an absence of value into itself. Some examples of sufficiencies of value are courage, self-esteem, magnanimity, moral fortitude and love. And death is one of the most blatant instances of absence that a sufficiency of value must overcome. However, this isn't an esoteric idea. The courage and love of parents, soldiers and heroes enable them to give up their lives for the sake of others. In looking for philosophical answers to the problem of death, we have previously found that the solutions of Lucretius, Viktor Frankl, Heidegger and Sartre weren't adequate. But framing the problem of death in the form of an absence of the future produces different questions and solutions. The new question is, what is required in the present to resist an absence of the future? The answer is a sufficiency of value in the present, illustrated by the above examples of love. Yet the idea of value sufficiency as an antidote to negativity and absence doesn't just apply to death. It can change one's whole personal experience, relations with other people and to society. I believe that sufficient self-value can mitigate anxiety and the guilt that produces it. In relation with others, the emphasis would be on to love others, not just to be loved. And we will be able to live our own values rather than the values of others with radical social consequences. There are significant effects of not looking to others in order to maintain our self-esteem. We would act in order to express our values rather than to secure social endorsement. This is neither a call to egoism or to arrogance, or to advocate the reverse condition of humility as a form of personal abasement. It's a relinquishment of egoistic self-concepts and excessive social endorsement, like in pride and fame. So this thinking doesn't lead to the ethical egoism of Ayn Rand, Max Stirner, or even Spinoza. And in value theory ethics, I argue strongly that it doesn't, and in fact provides a basis for ethics. In value theory ethics, an innate drive for value is affirmed by a will to and a choice for value. This choice is made because value satisfactions are the best available, and not to value value is self-defeating. And this will to value will result in ethical action because ethical action is the will to value. Yet more prosaically, the will to value will eventually result in the ethical treatment of others. This is because the will to value includes the values of absence and altruism. For example, harming others without cause is pathological, the knowledge of which reflects negative value onto the agent. Moreover, harming others is a symptom of an inferiority complex or low self-esteem or low self-value. And such actions contradict the principle of the will to value that the agent should have adopted. But value theory ethics is fallibilist and contingent upon the agent's attitudes and knowledge. Yet this is what a realistic theory of ethics looks like, not Kantian absolutism. And we can discuss ethics as a way into the ideas of subjectivity, value sufficiency, and an absence of value. Geoffrey Brennan and Philip Pettit, for example, base their ethical theory on the power of social esteem. They write that people desire the esteem of others and shrink from their disesteem. And they find agreement with this syndrome with, they say, just about everyone who is a forebear of modern social and political philosophy. This argues for the power of social esteem that is difficult to dispute. But social esteem has no traction without self-esteem that cares about how people regard oneself. And to establish self-esteem over social esteem is a mark of maturity, resilience and self-worth. My point here is that self-esteem is a form of value sufficiency, disregards social esteem as an absence of value. And self-esteem isn't acquired through the acquisition of objective properties, but through their absence. And again, this will have radical personal and social consequences. For example, in his book Honor Bound, sociologist Ryan Brown differentiates dignity cultures from honor cultures. That is, dignity cultures derive value from our humanity, but honor cultures derive value from reputation. For example, an award is an honor that would be undermined if everyone was awarded it. For more personal examples, we can look to Aristotle's virtues and his crowning virtue of magnanimity. Aristotle identifies eudaimonia as the supreme good, which he qualifies as self-sufficient. And as the supreme good is a moral concept, it can be inferred to be a sufficiency of value. Magnanimity, or greatness of soul, is Aristotle's crowning virtue that also implies an abundance of value. This abundance or sufficiency of value does not require retribution or revenge to compensate loss. By contrast, magnanimity can forgive hurt easily and can embrace the vicissitudes of life. The idea here is of a sufficiency of value that can take negativity into itself. We can add here that retribution or revenge is a psychological attempt to put things right or to restore order. Practically anything could do this: punishment, payment, an apology, or the death of a god. But in reality, there is no objective cosmological order that need to be put back into place. What is needed is a magnanimity or a sufficient value to count negativity as nothing. Aristotelian and Stoic ethics are both virtue theories, but Stoic ethics deals with negativity in a different way. To begin with, for Aristotle, the crowning virtue is magnanimity, but for Stoics it is wisdom. Yet my criticism of Stoic ethics is of indifference that is itself a form of negativity. Magnanimity, on the other hand, finds a way of integrating negativity into itself. In other words, sufficiency or sufficient value makes negativity into an absence. Another ethical attitude that expresses this sufficiency of value that can take on loss or absence is moral fortitude. Moral fortitude enables right action in difficult circumstances that lack support or social endorsement. A mature or resilient person can do the right thing without excessive social endorsement. Here again, we find a sufficiency of meaning that is able to embrace an absence. Ethical principles are values that guide moral action, and a meaningful life is worthwhile and valuable. So value is central to both ethics and meaning, but meaning is called upon to confront death more directly. This is because any viable theory of meaning must be able to handle the problem of death. And death is, of course, one of the great negativities in life that we must confront. We have already discussed overcoming the fear of death through love as a sufficiency of value. That is, death is an absence of the future that can be resolved by a sufficiency of value in the present. Conversely, the search for meaning or purpose in the future or in the external world can be regarded as a mistake resolved by accepting the absence of value in the world. But the death of others confronts us with a different kind of absence, an absence of the other person. And that absence evokes a sense of the uncanny, of how can they not be here? Yet this sense of the uncanny that accompanies every perception of absence. And as we have discussed previously, the uncanny brings us back to the uncanny as a fundamental experience of human existence as consciousness. That is, the consciousness that we can resolve in terms of a sufficiency of value that can integrate negativity and absence into itself. So in conclusion, these discussions have been a preface to the underlying idea of an amenability to absence. That is, an amenability that is enabled by a sufficiency of value that can embrace absence. And this embrace can be seen in moral fortitude, altruism, Christianity, love, attitudes to death, magnanimity, as well as in value refrain and the uncanny. And I've included a number of things that we should avoid in the notion of value refrain. These include moralistic and condemnatory judgments, as well as negative states like hate and resentment. They have also included several mistaken objectifications of value, such as intrinsic value, human rights, the concept of justice, as well as the idea of value itself. Ethics and of course religion have always been prime context for the objectification of value. This has been done to try to establish an objective foundation for ethical theory and moral action. But the failure of this attempt has led me to advocate a value theory ethics based on the subjectivity of consciousness and value and their inherent structures. It is here that I believe answers are to be found in the structures and relations of consciousness and value. That is, in the relations between consciousness and its external objects that produce value, and in the relation of consciousness and value with an absence or nothingness that have been initially discussed by such as Hegel and Sartre. So let me have your criticisms and comments at the meeting or on websites like YouTube or meetup.com.